In the bitter January of 1873, while most newlyweds in the Ohio Valley curled up in family-blessed cabins, Matthew and Olivia Carver were cast out for marrying late. They wintered in a riverbank cave, only to find it already furnished. A split-log bed, iron tools, a cold hearth left by a hermit who had died decades before. Then a rotting floorboard gave way to a diary that whispered of exile, a mapped coal seam, and a fortune hidden beneath the snow. This was no ordinary shelter. The cave at Whisper Hollow had swallowed outcasts for generations, and now it held Matthew and Olivia Carver, two young souls disowned by their own blood for loving too late. With no fire, no food, and a January freeze hardening the riverbank, they were already planning their deaths. Then the floorboards groaned under their weight and they found the diary. It belonged to Elijah Solward, a hermit who vanished in 1845, cast out himself. His words promised coal, but the real question was whether a dead man's secret could save two people the world had already buried. But to understand what Matthew and Olivia Carver found inside that cave, you have to understand what they had already lost outside of it. The trouble began not with the winter of 1873, but with a wedding in the autumn of 1872 that no one wanted to happen. Matthew Carver was 32 years old, a cooper by trade, the son of a prominent Steubenville merchant who had already chosen a bride for his son, the daughter of a local barrel supplier, a match that would have merged two family businesses into one. Olivia Harlow, 28, was the quiet daughter of a widowed dressmaker who believed her child had waited too long, missed her chance, and should be grateful for whatever arrangement could still be made. But Olivia had rejected every suitor her mother paraded through the parlor, not out of defiance, but because she had already chosen. She had chosen Matthew. The two had known each other since childhood, growing up on opposite sides of the same street, separated only by a narrow lane and a widening gulf of family expectation. For years they had been told their friendship was improper, that Matthew needed to focus on the family business, that Olivia was growing too old for girlish fancies. And when they finally announced their intention to marry, both families reacted not with disappointment but with something closer to fury. Matthew's father accused Olivia of trapping his son, of being a spinster desperate enough to ruin a good man's future. Olivia's mother called the marriage a betrayal, a public humiliation, proof that her daughter cared nothing for the sacrifices that had been made for her. Neither family attended the ceremony on October 8, 1872. The vows were spoken in a small chapel with only the minister and two witnesses present, strangers brought in from the street. And when the newlyweds returned to collect their belongings from their respective family homes, they found the doors locked, their clothes and tools piled on the porch, and a note from Matthew's father that read only, "You have made your bed. Lie in it." They were cast out in the final days of autumn, with no savings, no land, and no family willing to shelter them. For weeks they drifted through the Ohio Valley, sleeping in barns that farmers abandoned for the season, taking whatever odd work they could find. Matthew repaired barrels for a few coins. Olivia sewed garments and sold them at mining camps and river towns. They lived hand to mouth, always moving, always one frost away from starvation. And as November turned to December, as the first hard snow began to dust the ridges above the Ohio River, they knew they could not survive the winter exposed. They needed walls, a roof, something permanent. That was when an old riverman named Jasper Muncie told them about Whisper Hollow. Muncie was a grizzled ferryman who had spent 60 years on the Ohio, and he remembered things most people had long forgotten. He told them about a cave cut into a riverbank hollow several miles south of Steubenville, a place that had once belonged to a hermit named Elijah Solward. Nobody knew much about Solward, Muncie said. He had appeared in the valley sometime around 1835, a quiet man who kept to himself and never spoke of his past. Some said he was a fugitive. Others said he was a holy man or a madman. But whatever he had been, he had disappeared during the winter of 1845, and nobody had seen him since. The cave had stood empty for nearly 30 years. It was probably nothing more than a hole in the hill by now, Muncie warned them. But it was a hole that might offer shelter, and shelter was more than they had. Matthew and Olivia made the journey on foot in the first week of January 1873, following the frozen riverbank south through snow that rose past their ankles and then their knees. Olivia had already begun to show the first small signs of pregnancy, though neither of them had spoken of it aloud yet. The wind cut through their thin coats like a blade, and their hands grew so numb that Olivia dropped her sewing bag twice before Matthew finally strapped it to his own back. They walked for 2 days. 2 days of white silence, of breath that hung frozen in the air, of the river moving black and slow beside them under ice. And on the second afternoon, just as the light began to fail, they saw it. A dark slit in the riverbank, half hidden by dead brush and hanging vines, framed by two ancient sycamores whose roots twisted down into the frozen mud like the fingers of buried giants. The entrance was low, barely 5 feet high, and Matthew had to stoop to step inside. Olivia followed, her hand gripping the back of his coat, and the darkness swallowed them both. The first thing they noticed was not the cold. It was the silence. The wind that had screamed along the river for 2 days simply stopped at the cave mouth, as though someone had closed a door. Inside, the air was still and dry, heavy with the smell of old earth and something else, something sharper like cold ash and rust. Matthew struck a match from the small tin he carried, and the trembling flame revealed what neither of them had dared to hope for. The cave was not empty. It was furnished. Along one wall stood a split-log bed, its frame warped with age but still sturdy, the mattress long since rotted away. Beside it, a small table made from a single plank of oak, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust and mouse droppings. And near the back, a cold hearth built from river stones, with an iron pot still hanging from a hook above it. Tools lay scattered across the floor as though someone had simply set them down and walked away decades ago. A rusted axe, a pick, a coil of old rope so brittle it crumbled when Matthew touched it. The cave had been lived in, and lived in for years, by someone who had clearly intended to stay. The hermit Elijah Solward had not just sheltered in this hollow. He had built a home here. Olivia crossed the cave slowly, her boots scraping against the packed dirt floor, and stopped beside a pile of old fabric shoved into a corner. She knelt, brushed away the dust, and found a canvas coat, a pair of leather boots so stiff with age they felt like stone, and a small wooden box bound with rusted iron bands. She pried it open carefully, and inside she found what at first looked like a stack of old rags. But when she lifted them into the matchlight, she realized they were papers, dozens of them, covered in cramped handwriting that crawled across every inch. A journal, Elijah Solward's journal. And even before she could read the first page, Olivia felt the hair rise on the back of her neck, because she recognized the date scrawled at the top of the first entry. It was the same year she and Matthew had been born, the same year their families had first settled in Steubenville. It was as though the cave had been waiting for them all along. But the diary was not the only thing hidden in that corner. Beneath where the box had sat, Olivia noticed something else. A section of the floorboard was slightly raised, the wood discolored, the dirt around it packed differently than the rest. She pressed her hand against it and the board shifted. Beneath it, a hollow space. And inside that space, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp, a single folded map. Matthew held the match closer as Olivia unfolded the brittle paper across her knees. The map was crude, drawn in ink that had faded to a pale brown, but the markings were unmistakable. It showed the river, the hollow, the hills rising behind the cave, and a jagged line that cut deep into the earth beneath them. A seam, a coal seam, marked with a single word in Solward's careful handwriting. Hours. The match burned down to Matthew's fingers, and the darkness rushed back in. But in that darkness, Olivia whispered the question neither of them had spoken yet. Who was he? Because the hermit who had vanished 30 years before was no longer just a ghost. He was a man who had left his home furnished, his tools ready, and a fortune mapped beneath the floorboards. He had prepared for someone to follow him. And now Matthew and Olivia Carver had to ask themselves whether they were that someone, or whether they were walking into a trap laid by a dead man who had known exactly what was coming. Matthew relit the lantern with the last of their oil that night, and Olivia opened the diary. The handwriting was small and tight, The letters crowded together as though the writer had feared running out of paper before running out of words. The first entry was dated March 12th, 1836, and it began with a confession that made Olivia's breath catch in her throat. "My name is Elijah Solward, and I have been erased." He did not mean killed. He meant removed, struck from the memory of the only community he had ever known. He had been a schoolmaster in a small settlement called Redstone Ford, a place that no longer appears on any map. He had lived there for 7 years, teaching children to read, keeping the town's records, and courting a young woman named Susanna Cole. And then, in the autumn of 1835, he had been accused of a crime he did not commit. The diary did not name the crime. It only said that Susanna's father had led the charge, and that the town had given Elijah a choice: leave before dawn or hang from the sycamore in the square. He fled with nothing but the clothes on his back and a single book in his pocket. The rest of his life had been stripped from him in a single night. Olivia looked up at Matthew, and in the flickering lantern light she saw her own shock reflected back at her. They had both believed their exile was unique, a singular cruelty dealt to them by stubborn families. But the words in this diary, written 37 years earlier, described exactly what they had endured: the locked doors, the belongings thrown onto the porch, the silence of neighbors who had smiled at them for years and then turned away when they walked past. Elijah Solward had been cast out for marrying late in his own way, for reaching toward a life that others had decided he did not deserve. And he had ended up in this same cave, staring at these same stone walls, wondering if the cold or the hunger would claim him first. The cave had not been a choice for him either. It had been a last resort, the only shelter that would accept a man whose name had been burned. But Elijah had not surrendered to the darkness. He had done something far more remarkable. He had built a life here. The diary entries over the following months described how he had carved the bed from a fallen oak, hauled river stones to build the hearth, and taught himself to hunt the small game that moved through the hollow. He had traded pelts at distant river towns where no one recognized his face. Slowly, methodically, he had transformed a hole in the riverbank into a home. And then, during the spring of 1838, he had dug too deep into the back wall of the cave and struck something that changed everything. Coal, not just a few nuggets, but a thick black seam that angled downward into the hill at nearly 30 degrees. The coal was of high quality, clean burning, the kind that riverboats paid well for. And suddenly Elijah Solward was no longer just a hermit. He was a man sitting on a fortune he could not spend. Because to sell coal, you needed to exist. You needed a deed, witnesses, a name that could be written on a contract. Elijah had none of those things. The same town that had cast him out had also taken his legal identity. He was a ghost, and a ghost could own nothing. For 15 years, Elijah lived in the cave guarding a secret that could have made him wealthy but that he dared not reveal. He traded small amounts of coal in secret, enough to buy tools and candles and paper, but never enough to draw attention. And all the while, the bitterness curdled inside him. The diary entries grew darker, angrier. He wrote about Susanna, who had married another man just 3 months after his exile. He wrote about the town fathers who had condemned him without evidence. And in the final pages, dated December 1844, he wrote something that made Olivia's hands tremble. "I have prepared this place for the one who comes after, not my kin, for I have none. But one day this hollow will find another soul like mine, another outcast, another erased. And when that soul arrives, they will find everything I have left behind. Let them know they are not the first. Let them know the world has always been cruel to those who love too late." That was the last entry. Elijah Solward had vanished sometime in the winter of 1845, leaving his home fully furnished, his tools laid out, his map hidden beneath the floorboards. He had not died in the cave. The diary simply stopped, as though he had walked out into the snow one morning and never returned. Perhaps he had finally succumbed to the cold. Perhaps he had decided to move on, to try again somewhere else. Or perhaps something else had happened to him, something the diary would never reveal. But the map remained, and the coal seam remained. And now Matthew and Olivia Carver, two people who had been erased just as thoroughly as Elijah ever had, were holding the keys to the kingdom he had built in exile. They began exploring the mine the very next morning. The back of the cave opened into a narrow passage that Elijah had widened with a pickaxe, its walls dark with coal dust and still smelling faintly of ancient fire. Matthew crawled through first with the lantern, and the tunnel opened into a chamber about 12 feet across where the seam lay exposed, a black ribbon cutting through layers of gray shale. Old timbers, rough-hewn but still solid, supported the ceiling. A small cart, rusted but functional, sat on a length of iron track that Elijah had laid by hand. The mine was not large, but it was functional. It was ready. The dead man had left them a working coal mine. Within a week, Matthew and Olivia had begun to extract small amounts of coal. They broke it from the seam with the hermit's rusted pick, loaded it into the cart, and hauled it to the cave entrance. The work was brutal. Matthew's hands blistered and bled, and Olivia's arms ached from pulling the cart over the rough passage floor. But coal meant fire, and fire meant survival. They burned some of it in the hearth, warming the cave for the first time in decades, and watched as the light danced across the walls that had sheltered a ghost before them. The coal burned cleaner and hotter than any wood they had ever used, and for the first time since their exile began, they felt something that might have been hope. But survival required more than warmth. They needed food, medicine, supplies, and to get those they needed money. So Matthew took a risk. He loaded a sack of coal onto a makeshift sled he had built from the old bed frame and dragged it north along the frozen river to a trading post near Steubenville. The trader, a wary man named Calder, examined the coal with suspicion. He asked where it had come from. Matthew told him a partial truth, that he was working a small seam on land he hoped to claim. Calder did not ask more questions. He paid Matthew 12 cents for the sack, and Matthew returned to the cave with a small bag of flour, a slab of salt pork, and a tin of lamp oil. It was not much, but it was enough to keep them alive for another week. And the coal seam was deep, very deep. Over the following days, Matthew made more trips to the trading post. Each time he brought more coal, and each time Calder's suspicion grew. One afternoon, a group of rivermen at the post began asking questions. They had seen Matthew coming and going along the frozen bank. They had noticed the coal dust on his coat, the strange direction he always walked. A young man named Dade Younger, the son of a local land speculator, took particular interest. Dade was the type of man who smelled money the way a hound smelled blood, and he had grown up hearing old stories about the Whisper Hollow area, about a hermit who had once lived there, about rumors of a hidden seam that had never been properly claimed. He began following Matthew from a distance, tracking his path along the river. Olivia saw him first. She was standing near the cave entrance, gathering snow to melt for water when she noticed a figure on the ridge above the hollow. He was too far away to recognize, but he was watching. He stood there for nearly 5 minutes without moving, and then he turned and disappeared into the trees. That night, Olivia told Matthew what she had seen. Neither of them slept well. The cave had felt like a sanctuary. Now it was beginning to feel like a trap. They had no legal claim to the land. They had no deed, no witnesses, no proof that the mine belonged to them. If someone like Dade Younger decided to seize it, there was nothing they could do to stop him. The coal that was supposed to save them might instead become the thing that destroyed them. But the diary held one more secret. As Olivia flipped through the later pages, looking for anything that might help them, she found a section she had skipped over before. It was dated November 18, 44, just a few weeks before Elijah's final entry. In it, he wrote that he had filed a land claim, not under his own name, which had been ruined, but under a different name entirely, a name he had invented and paid a lawyer in Cincinnati to register. The claim covered the hill above the cave and the mineral rights beneath it. And the name he had used was one Olivia recognized immediately, because it was the same last name as the minister who had married her and Matthew, the same man whose tiny chapel had witnessed their vows. Elijah Solward had never been able to use the claim himself, but the claim was still there, sitting in a county record book, waiting for someone who could prove they were the rightful heir. And suddenly, the ghost had handed them not just a coal mine. He had handed them the one thing they had never dared to hope for, a way to exist again. But hope on paper was not the same as hope in hand. The land claim Elijah Solward had filed existed only in a county record book 40 miles north, in the courthouse at Cadiz, and the Carvers had no way to reach it without exposing themselves. Dade Younger had begun watching the hollow more openly now, riding the ridge above the cave at odd hours, sometimes with another man whose face Matthew did not recognize. They made no secret of their interest. They wanted to know where the coal was coming from. They wanted to know who these two strangers were who had appeared from the frozen river like ghosts. And Matthew understood with a cold certainty that if he left Olivia alone in the cave to make the journey to Cadiz, Dade might move on the mine before he returned. The rich seam Elijah had guarded for years could be stolen in a single afternoon. So Olivia made the decision for both of them. She would go. She was smaller, less recognizable, and the river towns were full of women traveling alone to trade or visit relatives. No one would question her. She wrapped herself in every layer they owned, tucked the diary and the map into the lining of her coat, and stepped out into a bitter dawn that seemed to freeze the very light. Matthew stood at the cave entrance and watched her climb the ridge toward the old trace road, her footprints filling with snow behind her. Neither of them spoke of what would happen if she did not return. Olivia walked through that first day in a white silence so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat beneath the wool. She followed the trace road north, past farmsteads buried to their eaves, past frozen creeks that groaned beneath their ice. Twice, she heard hoofbeats behind her and ducked into the trees, but it was only local farmers hauling firewood. By nightfall, she had reached a small settlement called Hopedale, where an innkeeper's wife took pity on her and let her sleep by the kitchen fire for a few pennies. The woman asked no questions, but her eyes lingered on Olivia's worn coat and the strange bulge of the diary against her ribs. Olivia told her she was a widow traveling to family in Cadiz. The lie tasted like ash. She reached the Harrison County Courthouse on the second afternoon, her fingers so numb that she could barely grip the iron door handle. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the smell of old paper and stove smoke. A clerk named Mr. Greeley, a thin man with spectacles and a permanent frown, listened to her request with growing impatience. She asked to see the land claim records from 1844. He asked under what name. She told him the name Elijah had used in the diary, Augustus Fielding. Greeley disappeared into the records room for nearly an hour. When he returned, he was carrying a single folded document tied with faded ribbon. He laid it on the counter between them, but he did not let go of it. The claim was valid, he said. It had been filed on November 22, 1844, witnessed by a Cincinnati attorney named Josiah Crane, and it covered exactly the parcel that included the Whisper Hollow cave and the hillside behind it. But there was a problem. The claim had never been transferred. It still belonged to the original filer, Augustus Fielding, who had never appeared to pay the patent fee or finalize the deed. The land had been sitting in legal limbo for 29 years, unclaimed and unresolvable, because Fielding had vanished without a trace. Greeley looked at Olivia over his spectacles and asked the question she had been dreading. What was her connection to Augustus Fielding? She could have lied. She could have produced some forged letter, some invented kinship. But Olivia had spent too many months living a lie already. Instead, she told the truth. She told Greeley everything. The cave, the hermit, the diary. She even showed him the map and the journal entries, her hands trembling as she spread the brittle papers across the counter. Greeley read in silence, his frown deepening with every page. When he finished, he removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything. He knew the name Elijah Solward. He remembered his father talking about the case when he was a boy. The schoolmaster who had been run out of Redstone Ford. The town that no longer existed because it had burned down in 1851, taking most of its records with it. And he remembered something else. The town that had cast Elijah out had been founded on land that was never properly claimed. The men who had condemned him had been squatters on disputed territory. The entire judgment had been built on an authority that did not legally exist. Greeley leaned forward and lowered his voice. If Augustus Fielding was indeed Elijah Solward, and if Elijah Solward was dead, Then the claim could be inherited by anyone who could prove a legal connection. But there was a faster path. The land could be purchased outright from the county for the unpaid patent fee, which amounted to $1.25 per acre. The whole parcel was 60 acres, $75. It was more money than Olivia and Matthew had ever possessed in their lives, but it was not an impossible sum. The coal in that hillside was worth 100 times that much, and if they could raise the money before anyone else filed a competing claim, the land would be theirs. Legally, permanently, undeniably theirs. Olivia left the courthouse with the claim document copied into her own hand and a new fear burning in her chest. The journey home would take 2 days, and every hour she was gone, Dade Younger might be making his own discoveries. She did not know that Dade had already made them. While Olivia was in Cadiz, Dade had ridden to Steubenville and begun asking questions about the man who had been selling coal at Calder's trading post. He had learned Matthew's real name. He had learned about the Carver family, about the disowned son, about the marriage that had scandalized the town. And from an old man who remembered the valley's secrets, he had learned the name Whisper Hollow and the legend of the hermit's coal. Dade did not need a diary. He had enough pieces to see the whole picture, and he was already moving. Matthew sensed the danger before he saw it. On the third morning after Olivia left, the air around the hollow changed. The birds stopped moving. The wind shifted. And then he heard the sound of horses on the ridge, 2 riders. He ducked into the cave entrance and crouched behind the old bed frame, his hand closing around the hermit's rusted axe. The riders did not come down. They sat on the ridge for a long time, their voices carrying down in fragments. Matthew caught only a few words. Registered, mine, January. Then the riders turned and disappeared. That night, alone in the cave with the lantern burning low, Matthew opened the diary to the final pages and read the last words Elijah had ever written. And then he noticed something he had missed before. Tucked into the binding, folded so small it was nearly invisible, was a second piece of paper. It was a letter, addressed to no one, written in a different hand than Elijah's. And it was signed by Josiah Crane, the Cincinnati attorney who had witnessed the land claim. The letter stated that on November 22, 1844, Elijah Solward had paid Crane a retainer of $40 in gold, and that Crane had agreed to hold an additional document, a sworn affidavit, that would prove Elijah's true identity and his rightful ownership of the claim. The affidavit was to be released only upon Elijah's death to whoever presented the diary as evidence. Crane was still alive. His law office still existed in Cincinnati. And the affidavit was still there, waiting at the bottom of a file box that had not been opened in 29 years. Olivia returned to Whisper Hollow on the 6th day, half frozen and barely able to stand, but with the copied claim and the name Josiah Crane burning in her mind. She told Matthew everything: the clerk's revelation that Elijah had used a false name, the affidavit waiting in Cincinnati, the fragile thread that connected a dead hermit's legal claim to 2 outcasts he had never met. Matthew listened in silence and then told her what he had found in the diary's binding. The letter from Crane was not just a receipt for a retainer. It was a legal declaration. It stated that whoever presented the diary and the affidavit together would be recognized as Elijah Solward's designated successor. The hermit had not just prepared the cave. He had prepared a will, but they could not wait for spring. Dade Younger had been seen at the Steubenville courthouse, asking about unclaimed land parcels along the Ohio. He had money, influence, and a father who knew every speculator in the county. The race for the hollow had already begun. So Matthew and Olivia Carver wrapped themselves in every scrap of cloth they owned, strapped the diary and map tight against their bodies, and stepped into the January wind for a journey of 140 miles. The Ohio River was frozen in places, black and treacherous in others. They walked the towpaths and frozen wagon roads, sometimes hitching rides on coal barges making the slow push upstream. Olivia felt the child moving inside her, a flutter no larger than a moth, but she did not speak of it. She only kept walking. The cold was not a weather now. It was an enemy with hands, and it tried to pull them down with every mile. They reached Cincinnati on the 14th of January, their boots worn through and their faces raw, and found the law office of Crane and Associates on a narrow street near the riverfront. The building was old, its sign faded, but inside, a younger man named Arthur Crane, the son of Josiah, kept his father's files in perfect order. When Matthew showed him the letter and the diary, Arthur did not ask for explanation. He had heard the story from his father, who had died 5 years earlier but had spoken often of the strange schoolmaster who had paid $40 in gold for an affidavit he never collected. Arthur opened a fireproof safe, withdrew a sealed envelope, and handed it to Olivia with hands that trembled faintly. The envelope was addressed simply, "To the one who holds my book." Inside was a sworn statement, witnessed by Josiah Crane on November 22, 1844, affirming that Augustus Fielding was the legal pseudonym of Elijah Solward, and that the land claim at Whisper Hollow belonged to him and his rightful heirs or assigns. It was signed by Elijah himself, and beneath his name was a single word: survive. Armed with the affidavit, the Carvers caught a riverboat back upstream to Cadiz. They arrived at the Harrison County Courthouse on a Monday morning just as the clerk Greeley was unlocking the front door. But they were not the only ones there. Dade Younger stood at the counter, a sheaf of papers in his hand and a smug expression on his face. He had filed a competing claim the previous Friday, on the grounds that the original claimant had abandoned the parcel and died without heirs. The clerk had told him that the filing would take effect unless a superior claim was presented within 5 working days, and now the clock was ticking. Matthew stepped forward and laid the affidavit on the counter. Dade's smile vanished. Greeley read the document twice, turning each page with the slow deliberation of a man who understood that history was shifting beneath his hands. He consulted the land records, compared the signatures, and then looked at Dade with a calm that was far more devastating than anger. "This affidavit predates your claim by 29 years, he said. "It establishes continuous legal intention. The parcel belongs to the Solward estate, and these claimants present the documented right of succession. Your filing is void." Dade began to argue, his voice rising, but the clerk simply stamped the Carver's deed with the county seal and pushed it across the counter. The land was theirs. 60 acres, the coal seam, the cave, the hollow, all of it. Matthew and Olivia walked out of the courthouse into a cold afternoon that suddenly felt warmer than it had any right to. They had a deed. They had a home. And they had the legal identity that Elijah Solward had been denied his entire exile. The ghost had given them their existence back. But the winter was not finished with them. The month of February arrived with a storm that swallowed the valley whole. The Ohio froze solid from bank to bank, and the hollow lay buried under drifts that rose higher than the cave entrance. Matthew and Olivia burned the coal sparingly, feeding the hearth just enough to keep the cold at bay while the wind howled through the sycamores above. They had stored a small supply of food from the last trading trip: salt pork, beans, dried corn. They melted snow for water. And they waited. Olivia's pregnancy grew more visible now, the child shifting strongly enough that Matthew could feel the kicks when he pressed his hand to her belly at night. They named the child Hope, though they did not yet know if it would be a boy or a girl. They only knew that if they survived this winter, they would meet a person who had never known the sting of being cast out. The storm lasted 11 days. When the sky cleared at last, the world outside was silent and white, and glittering with a cold so pure it hurt to breathe. Matthew dug a tunnel through the drift at the cave mouth and stood blinking in the sunlight, staring at a landscape that had been reshaped entirely. The river was a sheet of polished silver. The trees wore sleeves of ice. And the hollow, which had once felt like a hiding place, now looked like something else entirely. It looked like a home. Spring came late to Whitaker Ridge, but when the thaw began, the Carvers went to work. Matthew reopened the mine, widening Elijah's old tunnels with patient labor, while Olivia tended the surface, hauling coal in the rusted cart and bagging it for sale. By May, they had produced enough to fill a small wagon, and Matthew took it to Steubenville himself, carrying the deed in his coat pocket and a calm certainty that no one could touch them now. The coals sold clean and hot and fast. Word spread along the river that the Carver mine at Whisper Hollow produced high-grade fuel at fair prices. Rivermen, blacksmiths, and merchants placed orders. By summer, Matthew had hired 2 workers from Hopedale, and Olivia had a small garden growing in the sunlight just outside the cave. The hermit's bed had been rebuilt with fresh pine. The hearth fire never went cold. And on the 22nd of August 1873, with the cicadas singing in the sycamores, Olivia gave birth to a girl. They named her Hope Charity Carver, her middle name taken from the minister who had married them, the same name Elijah had once borrowed to file a land claim. The circle closed, but the cave had one more secret to reveal. In the autumn of 1874, while extending the main tunnel deeper into the hillside, Matthew broke through a wall of soft shale and into a small chamber that the hermit had never mapped. On the floor of the chamber lay a human skeleton, its bones arranged as though the person had lain down to sleep and simply never risen. Remnants of clothing still clung to the frame: a canvas coat, leather boots, and around the neck, a cord holding a small iron key. It was Elijah's sword. He had not walked out into the snow. He had retreated into the deepest part of his mine, the place only he knew, and died there alone, guarding the seam that had been his only legacy. Beside his hand sat a small iron box. The key on his neck opened it. Inside were $42 in gold coin, the remainder of the coal money he had earned in secret, saved across 15 years of silent labor, and a final scrap of paper on which he had written only this: "If you have found me, you are already free." The same message was carved into the stone wall above his bones. He had known that someone would come. He had prepared for it with every tool, every timber, every word in the diary. And he had been right. Matthew and Olivia buried Elijah's sword in the meadow above the cave, beneath a white oak that overlooked the river he had once crossed as a fugitive. They marked the grave with a stone, but they did not carve his name. They carved a single word: found. Because the hermit who had been erased by his own town, who had lived as a ghost for 29 years after his death, had finally been given back what every human being deserves. He had been remembered. For more than 40 years, the Carver mine operated along the banks of Whisper Hollow. The cave became the storage shed for a proper house built above the ridge. The coal seam ran deep and true, yielding thousands of tons before it played out in the early 20th century. Matthew and Olivia raised 3 more children on that land. They paid wages to 20 workers at their peak. And when Matthew's father finally sent a letter in 1881, asking to see his grandchildren, the Carvers received him with a quiet dignity that asked no apologies. The feud ended not with a confrontation, but with the slow erosion that time brings to all grudges. And in the center of the property, still visible to anyone walking the riverbank, the black mouth of the cave remained open. Some local children called it Carver's Cave. The older folks still called it Whisper Hollow. But everyone who knew the story understood that the hollow had been whispering since long before the Carvers arrived. They had simply been the ones willing to listen. Here is the question that lingers long after the last shovel of coal was lifted. Did Elijah Sword choose the Carvers, or did the hollow choose them all along? The diary was written decades before they were born. The cave was furnished for someone who did not yet exist. The map was drawn for hands that had not yet reached into the dark. And the affidavit waited in a locked safe for 29 years, unclaimed, until a disowned couple with nothing left to lose appeared at the courthouse door. Coincidence is a word we use when we are unwilling to see the threads that connect us to people we have never met. But every now and then, in the quiet places along the river, you can still feel something pulling those threads tight. There are places in this world that hold more than dirt and stone. They hold memory. They hold the weight of every person who ever knelt by the same hearth, traced the same cracks in the wall, and wondered if tomorrow was worth seeing. Whisper Hollow was one of those places. It had been shaped by hands that were never meant to meet. Elijah Sword carved tunnels into the dark, not knowing who would ever follow. Olivia Carver lit the lantern, not knowing whose hands had left the flint beside the bed. And yet, across nearly 3 decades, 2 stories collided in that frozen riverbank as if they had been choreographed by something larger than coincidence. The truth the hollow teaches is not a comfortable one. It says that exile is older than any single family feud. That being cast out for marrying late, for loving the wrong person, for refusing to accept the life that was chosen for you, that is a pain that echoes. But it also says this: sometimes the exile itself prepares the way home. Elijah built a fortress of coal because he had no other legacy to leave. The Carvers inherited it because they had no other place to go. And in that strange intersection of abandonment and inheritance, a ghost and a young family prove that no one is truly erased as long as there is someone willing to find them. History is full of stories like this, buried under floorboards and sealed in courthouse vaults. Stories of people who were told they did not matter, and who mattered so much that their fingerprints are still visible on the walls of a cave you can visit today. Not all of them end with a deed and a daughter named Hope. Most end in silence. But the ones that survive remind us that the world is not as disconnected as it seems. The outcast of one generation builds the sanctuary of the next. The exile who dies alone and unknown may still save a family not yet born. And the cave that looked like a dead end may have always been a doorway. Next time you walk along a riverbank or through an old mining town, pay attention to the places the light doesn't reach easily. Listen for the wind moving through openings in the rock. You might hear something that doesn't belong to the present. You might feel the threads that stretch between your life and someone else's forgotten sorrow. Because the past does not vanish. It waits. And sometimes it even furnishes the cave. Subscribe to Cold Echoes and witness the stories history tried to bury but could never quite extinguish.